The crimson horizon swallowed the last train of the day as Grace Taylor clutched her 5-year-old son's hand, watching her husband's silhouette disappear into the distance. She hadn't expected him to actually leave them there at the Val Verde Depot in southern Texas, with nothing but a small carpet bag and the clothes on their backs. The year was 1878, and as the dust settled around her worn boots, Grace realized with gut-wrenching clarity that Thomas was never coming back. "Mama, where did Papa go?" Samuel asked, his innocent blue eyes looking up at her with confusion. "He said he was going to get tickets." Grace swallowed hard, fighting back tears. At 26, she never imagined she'd be abandoned in a strange town with a child to care for and not a penny to her name. Thomas had gambled away their savings, promised a fresh start in California, and now had clearly decided a wife and child were too much baggage for whatever schemes he had planned. "He'll be a while, sweetheart," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The station was emptying quickly as the evening shadows lengthened. The station master gave her a pitying look before locking up the ticket office. "Madam, we're closing up for the night. You need to find lodging," he said, not unkindly. Grace nodded, trying to maintain her dignity. "Of course. We'll just wait a bit longer. My husband should return shortly." The station master's expression told her he'd seen this scenario before. "Town's that way," he said, pointing down the dusty main street. "The Wayfarers Inn might have a room if you've got money." She didn't. Thomas had taken every last cent. As the station master walked away, Samuel tugged at her skirt. "I'm hungry, Mama." Grace bent down, smoothing his dark curls. "We'll find something soon, I promise." The platform was now deserted except for a tall figure leaning against a post at the far end. He'd been watching her, she realized with a jolt. A cowboy, judging by his worn leather chaps and the hat pulled low over his eyes. She clutched Samuel closer, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were. The man approached with unhurried steps, his spurs making a rhythmic jingling sound against the wooden platform. Grace straightened her spine, holding Samuel behind her skirts. "Evenin', madam," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Seems to me you've been left in a difficult spot." Up close, she could see his face clearly weathered by sun and wind, with striking green eyes that assessed her situation with uncomfortable accuracy. He wasn't young, perhaps in his early 30s, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. "My husband will return shortly," Grace lied again, more firmly this time. The cowboy glanced down the empty tracks, then back at her with an expression that told her he wasn't fooled. "Name's Hank Owens. I run the Double Circle Ranch about 10 miles outside of town. I'm Grace Taylor." "This is my son, Samuel," she replied stiffly, wondering why she'd volunteered their names. Hank crouched down to Samuel's level. "How old are you, partner?" "I'm 5, Samuel said, peeking out from behind Grace's skirts. "Are you a real cowboy?" "Sure am," Hank said with a gentle smile that transformed his face. "Got horses and everything." Samuel's eyes widened. "Real horses, Samuel," Grace cautioned, placing her hand on his shoulder. Hank stood, his expression turning serious as he addressed Grace. "Mrs. Taylor, I don't mean to presume, but it seems to me you've been abandoned. Night's falling, and Val Verde isn't the kind of place for a woman and child to be wandering without purpose or protection." Grace felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "We'll be fine." "No doubt," Hank said easily. "But maybe you could use a meal and a place to stay tonight while you figure things out." She hesitated, her mind racing. Trust no one had been her mother's advice, especially men with kind eyes. But Samuel was hungry, and night was falling in a town she didn't know. "I couldn't impose," she said weakly. "It's no imposition. I've got a housekeeper at the ranch, Mrs. Beatrice Coleman, proper as they come. You'd be safe there while you decide your next steps." Grace studied him, looking for signs of deception or ill intent, but found none. Still, she trusted Thomas, and look where that had led her. "Why would you help strangers?" she asked bluntly. Something flickered in Hank's eyes, pain perhaps, or memory. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most." He looked down at Samuel, then back at Grace. "Let me help you both." "Just for tonight." Before she could answer, Samuel's stomach growled loudly in the silence. Hank smiled and Samuel giggled despite himself. "My wagon's just down the street," Hank said. "I've got business in town tomorrow morning, but I could take you both to the ranch tonight, give you a good meal and a safe place to sleep. Then bring you back to town tomorrow if that's what you want." Grace weighed her options, which were painfully few. The alternatives: begging on the streets, seeking charity at a church if she could find one, or worse, flashed through her mind. Hank seemed to sense her internal struggle. "I understand your caution, Mrs. Taylor. How about this? I'll take you both to Maddie's diner first. Get some food in your boy and you can decide after that." The mention of food made Samuel look up hopefully. Grace felt her resistance crumbling. "Very well, Mr. Owens. We'll accept your offer of dinner and then decide about the rest." Hank nodded, picking up her carpetbag without asking. He offered his other hand to Samuel, who took it readily, fascinated by the man's leather gloves and the silver ring on his pinky finger. As they walked down the steps of the depot, Grace caught Hank looking at her with an unreadable expression. "What is it?" she asked warily. "Just thinking," he said with a slight smile. "You and your boy left alone like this. It seems to me you're both mine now, at least to look after until you find your footing." The words were spoken with such simple sincerity that Grace didn't immediately register their presumption. When she did, she stopped walking. "Mr. Owens, I appreciate your help, but Samuel and I belong to no one but ourselves." Hank's eyes widened, and then he let out a low chuckle. "Poor choice of words, Mrs. Taylor. I meant only that I feel responsible for your welfare now that I've offered my help." "Nothing more." Grace nodded stiffly, but as they continued walking toward the diner, she couldn't help but notice the warmth of Hank's hand as it occasionally brushed against hers, steadying her on the uneven boardwalk. It had been a long time since anyone had shown her or Samuel genuine kindness. The diner was warm and filled with the smell of fresh bread and stew. The proprietress, a round woman with kind eyes named Maddie, greeted Hank like an old friend and didn't ask questions about Grace and Samuel. After they were seated at a corner table, Hank ordered 3 bowls of beef stew, cornbread, and milk for Samuel. When the food arrived, Grace had to remind Samuel not to eat too quickly. "Slow down, sweetheart. There's plenty." Hank watched them with quiet intensity that made Grace self-conscious. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Taylor?" "This morning," she answered, not meeting his eyes. In truth, she'd given most of her breakfast to Samuel. Hank pushed the basket of cornbread closer to her. "Eat. You need your strength." As they ate, Hank told them about his ranch. He'd built it from nothing 10 years ago, after returning from fighting in the war between the states. He now had 20 hands working for him, raising cattle and horses. Mrs. Coleman kept house, and her husband Jeremiah served as his foreman. "It's a good life," Hank said, watching Samuel's eyes grow heavy as his stomach filled. "Hard work but rewarding." "It sounds lovely," Grace said sincerely, trying to imagine such stability. As they finished their meal, Samuel crawled into her lap, his small body warm against hers. "Are we going to see the horses, Mama?" he murmured sleepily. Grace looked at Hank, who was paying their bill at the counter. His broad shoulders and straight posture spoke of strength, but it was the gentle way he'd spoken to Samuel that tipped the scales in her decision. When he returned to the table, Grace met his gaze. "We'll accept your offer of shelter for tonight, Mr. Owens. But tomorrow I need to find work in town. I won't be dependent on charity." "Fair enough," Hank agreed, his expression softening as he looked at the drowsy child in her arms. "Let me carry him to the wagon." Grace hesitated, then nodded, allowing Hank to lift Samuel from her lap. Her son instinctively wrapped his arms around the cowboy's neck, resting his head on Hank's shoulder. Something twisted in Grace's chest at the sight, longing, perhaps, for the family they should have been. Outside, Hank helped them into a sturdy wagon drawn by two dappled gray horses. Samuel, briefly revived by the sight of the animals, peppered Hank with questions about their names and habits until he finally drifted off, his head in Grace's lap. As they left the town behind, the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky. Grace had never seen so many, having spent most of her life in Cincinnati before Thomas convinced her to follow his dreams westward. "It's beautiful," she whispered, not wanting to wake Samuel. Hank glanced at her, his profile illuminated by moonlight. "It is. Most nights I still can't believe this is my home." "How did you end up here?" "In Val Verde," she asked, curious despite her caution. Hank was silent for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "I was running from ghosts after the war, rode as far as my horse would take me, worked odd jobs. Eventually found this valley. The land was cheap because water was scarce, but I discovered a spring on the property that others had overlooked." He shrugged. "Seemed like fate." "You believe in fate?" Grace asked. "I believe life has a way of putting us where we need to be, even if it's not where we plan to go." He glanced at her again. "What about you, Mrs. Taylor? What brought you west?" Grace stroked Samuel's hair, considering how much to reveal. "My husband had dreams of California. Gold and opportunity. We left Cincinnati 3 months ago, but the money ran out faster than expected." She swallowed hard. "I think he saw Samuel and me as burdens." "Then he's a fool," Hank said quietly, with such conviction that Grace looked up sharply. "Sorry," he added. "Not my place to judge." "No," Grace said softly, "but you're right. He is a fool. I just wish I'd realized it sooner." They lapsed into comfortable silence as the wagon rolled over the uneven terrain. Eventually, the dark silhouette of a large ranch house appeared against the starlit sky. "Welcome to Double Circle," Hank said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of a 2-story house built of sturdy logs and stone. Light spilled from the windows and a plump woman appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Owens." "We weren't expecting you back tonight," she called, then stopped when she saw Grace and Samuel. "Oh, company. Mrs. Coleman, this is Mrs. Grace Taylor and her son, Samuel. They'll be staying with us tonight," Hank explained as he helped Grace down from the wagon. "Mrs. Taylor, this is Mrs. Beatrice Coleman, the finest housekeeper in Texas." Beatrice's eyes were kind but shrewd as she assessed Grace's situation with a glance. "The blue room upstairs is ready. I'll just need to turn down the bed and add some fresh water." "Thank you," Grace said, suddenly overwhelmed by the woman's matter-of-fact acceptance. Hank lifted the still sleeping Samuel and led the way into a warm, welcoming home that smelled of pine and beeswax. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace with comfortable chairs arranged around it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than Grace had seen outside a proper library. "You read?" she asked, surprised. Hank smiled. "Winter nights are long. Books are good company." Beatrice bustled past them toward the stairs. "Follow me, dear. I'll show you where you'll sleep. Mr. Owens, there's stew keeping warm on the stove if you're hungry." "We ate in town, but thank you, Mrs. Coleman." Grace followed the housekeeper upstairs with Hank carrying Samuel behind them. The blue room, as Beatrice called it, was spacious and simply but beautifully furnished, with a large bed, a smaller trundle that could be pulled out, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. Hank laid Samuel gently on the bed. The boy stirred but didn't wake as Grace removed his shoes. "I'll leave you to settle in," Hank said. "Breakfast is usually at sunrise, but sleep as long as you need." "Thank you, Mr. Owens, for everything," Grace said, meeting his gaze directly. Something passed between them in that moment, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of kindred spirits. "Good night, Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice soft. After he left, Beatrice helped Grace unpack her meager belongings and provided a nightgown for her and a small shirt for Samuel. "Mr. Owens is a good man," Beatrice said as she turned down the covers. "One of the best I've known." "You've worked for him long, 8 years now. Came with my husband after the drought took our farm." She shook her head. "Mr. Owens gave us purpose again, treated us like family. He does that, sees what people need and tries to provide it." Grace pondered this as she prepared for bed. When Beatrice left, she lay beside Samuel in the comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the creak of the house settling, the whisper of the wind in the eaves. For the first time since Thomas had abandoned them, she allowed herself to cry, silent tears sliding into the pillow as she finally acknowledged the betrayal and fear. But mingled with the grief was something unexpected: hope. In this place, with these people, perhaps they could find their footing again. Samuel stirred beside her, his small hand finding hers in the darkness. "Mama, is this our home now?" Grace squeezed his hand gently. "Just for tonight, sweetheart. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "I like Mr. Hank," Samuel murmured, drifting back to sleep. "He smells like horses and candy." Grace smiled despite her tears, wondering what twist of fate had led them to this man and his ranch. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I like him too." The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns across the quilt. Grace woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Samuel was already awake, sitting by the window and watching the activity in the ranch yard below. "Mama, there are so many horses," he exclaimed when he noticed she was awake. "And cowboys, real ones." Grace joined him at the window. Below, men moved purposefully around the corral and outbuildings. She spotted Hank immediately, his tall figure distinctive even from a distance as he worked with a spirited chestnut horse in the round pen. "He's teaching that horse to trust him," came Beatrice's voice from the doorway. She carried a tray with a pitcher of water and fresh towels. "Mr. Owens has a way with wild things. Never breaks them, just convinces them that working together is better than fighting." She set down the tray and smiled. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are. I've laid out some clothes that might fit you both." Grace thanked her, grateful for the woman's quiet efficiency and lack of prying questions. The clothes, a simple blue dress for Grace and sturdy pants and a shirt for Samuel, were slightly worn but clean and of good quality. "These are very fine," Grace said as she helped Samuel dress. "Are you sure we can borrow them?" "They were my daughter's," Beatrice explained. "She's married now, living in Austin. The boys' clothes belonged to Mr. Owens' nephew when he visited last summer." Dressed and freshened, they made their way downstairs to the kitchen, where the delicious smell of coffee, bacon, and biscuits filled the air. Hank was already seated at the large wooden table, discussing the day's work with an older man Grace assumed must be Jeremiah Coleman. Hank stood when they entered, his eyes warming at the sight of them. "Good morning. I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Grace replied, noting how the morning light accentuated the auburn highlights in his dark hair and the laugh lines around his eyes. Samuel, less reserved, ran straight to Hank. "I saw you teaching that horse. Can I learn to do that too?" Hank chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "That takes years of practice, but I could show you a few things after breakfast if your mother approves." Samuel looked at Grace with pleading eyes. "Please, Mama." "We shouldn't impose on Mr. Owens' time," Grace began. "It's no imposition," Hank said. "Truth be told, I could use a good assistant this morning." Unable to resist Samuel's excitement, Grace nodded. "Very well, but just for a little while. We need to return to town afterward so I can inquire about work." Breakfast was a lively affair, with the Colemans and two young ranch hands joining them. The conversation flowed easily, focusing on ranch matters rather than personal questions that might have made Grace uncomfortable. She found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of good food and company. After breakfast, true to his word, Hank took Samuel to the corral while Grace helped Beatrice with the dishes, despite the older woman's protests. "I insist," Grace said firmly. "It's the least I can do for your hospitality." From the kitchen window, she could see Hank lifting Samuel onto the fence of the corral, explaining something as he gestured toward the horses. Samuel's face was alight with wonder, nodding eagerly at whatever Hank was telling him. "He's good with children," Beatrice commented, following Grace's gaze. "Always has been, though he never had any of his own." "He's not married?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. Beatrice shook her head. "Was engaged once years ago. Elizabeth was her name. She died of fever before they could wed." She glanced at Grace. "He doesn't speak of it, but it changed him, made him more solitary, more focused on building this place." Grace watched as Hank now led a gentle bay mare to where Samuel waited. With careful hands, he helped the boy stroke the horse's nose. Samuel's delighted laugh carried through the open window. "Your husband?" Beatrice ventured cautiously. "Will he be looking for you?" Grace stiffened, then deliberately relaxed her shoulders. "No. He made his choice quite clear when he left us at the depot yesterday." Beatrice's hand covered hers briefly. "Then perhaps it's a blessing in disguise. Some men aren't worth the heartache they bring." Grace nodded, surprised at how little pain she felt at acknowledging Thomas's abandonment. The anger was there, and concern for their future, but the heartbreak she'd expected was muted. Perhaps, she realized, their marriage had been dying long before he physically left them. After helping with the morning chores, Grace went outside to find Samuel sitting atop the bay mare, his small hands clutching the saddle horn while Hank led the horse in a slow circle around the corral. "Look, Mama, I'm riding." "I see that," Grace called, her heart swelling at his joy. It had been too long since she'd seen him so carefree. Hank lifted Samuel down and the boy ran to her, words tumbling out in excitement. "Mr. Hank says I'm a natural, and the horse's name is Daisy, and she's the gentlest one on the ranch. And I helped feed her apples and—" "Slow down," Grace laughed, smoothing his tousled hair. "It sounds like you've had quite the adventure." Hank approached, wiping his hands on a bandana. The morning sun highlighted the strong planes of his face, and Grace found herself noticing the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. "He's a quick learner," Hank said, smiling down at Samuel. "Got a natural seat on a horse." "Like my papa?" Samuel asked innocently. An awkward silence fell. Grace hadn't discussed Thomas with Samuel yet, unsure how to explain that his father had abandoned them. Hank crouched to Samuel's level. "I didn't know your pa, but I'd say you've got your own special talents. That's important, being your own person." Samuel considered this, then nodded seriously. "I want to be like you when I grow up, a horse teacher." "Horse trainer," Hank corrected gently, "and that's a fine ambition." He straightened and turned to Grace. "I need to head into town soon. You're welcome to ride along if you still want to look for work there." Grace nodded, though she felt a pang at the thought of leaving the ranch's tranquility. "Yes, I should. The sooner I find employment, the sooner Samuel and I can establish ourselves." Hank studied her face for a moment, then said, "There's another option if you're interested." "Oh, Mrs. Coleman mentioned this morning that she could use help with the household. The ranch is growing and there are more men to cook for, more rooms to maintain." He hurried on before she could respond. "It would include room and board for you both, and a modest salary. Samuel could attend the small school about 3 miles from here. Several of the Hand's children go there." Grace was stunned by the offer. "Mr. Owens, that's very generous, but it's not charity," he interrupted, seeming to anticipate her objection. "It's honest work that needs doing. Mrs. Coleman isn't as young as she once was, though don't tell her I said so." Samuel tugged at her skirt. "Please, Mama." "I want to stay with the horses." Grace hesitated. The offer was tempting, a safe place for Samuel, steady work, the chance to regroup before deciding their next move. And if she were honest with herself, the thought of Hank's quiet presence was more appealing than it should be. "May I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course. The offer stands either way." He checked his pocket watch. "I should hitch up the wagon if we're going to town." While Hank prepared for the journey, Grace took Samuel inside to wash his hands and face, which were smudged with dirt from the corral. "I really want to stay here, Mama," Samuel said as she wiped a damp cloth across his cheek. "Mr. Hank said he might teach me to ride by myself someday." "I know, sweetheart, but we need to be practical. We can't impose on Mr. Owens' generosity indefinitely." "But he said you could work here," Samuel persisted with a child's logic, "and I could go to school and learn about horses." Grace sighed, smoothing his dark curls. "It's complicated, Samuel." "Why, don't you like it here?" "I do," she admitted. "Very much, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain her reservations. "Is it because you're scared?" Samuel asked perceptively. Grace stared at her son, surprised by his insight. "What makes you say that?" Samuel shrugged. "You look scared sometimes, like when Papa was angry." Her heart clenched. She hadn't realized Samuel had noticed the tension in their household, the careful way she'd navigated around Thomas's moods. "Mr. Hank isn't scary," Samuel continued. "He's nice. And he looks at you like you're special." Heat rose to Grace's cheeks. "Does he now?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "Like you're one of his books, the ones he keeps careful on the shelf." Before Grace could respond to this unexpectedly poetic observation, Beatrice called from downstairs that the wagon was ready. The ride to town was pleasant. The spring morning neither too hot nor too cool. Samuel sat between them on the wagon seat, chattering about the horses and asking Hank endless questions about ranch life. Grace noticed how patiently Hank answered each query, treating Samuel's curiosity with respect rather than indulgence. Val Verde looked different in daylight, a small but bustling town with a main street lined with various businesses. Grace counted a general store, a bank, a doctor's office, a small hotel, and several saloons among the establishments. "What kind of work were you hoping to find?" Hank asked as they approached the town center. "I can sew quite well," Grace replied. "I worked as a seamstress before I was married, or perhaps there's a position at the hotel. I'm not particular as long as it's honest work." Hank nodded. "Maddie at the diner might know of something. She hears all the town gossip." He pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store. "I need to pick up some supplies and speak with the bank manager. Would you like me to introduce you to Maddie first?" "Yes, thank you." They crossed the street to the diner, Samuel between them, holding both their hands and occasionally swinging himself forward with childish exuberance. Several people nodded to Hank in greeting, their curious gazes lingering on Grace and Samuel. Maddie welcomed them warmly, her eyes twinkling as she looked from Hank to Grace. "Well now, good to see you again so soon. Coffee's fresh if you're interested." "Actually, Maddie," Hank said, "Mrs. Taylor here is looking for work in town. I thought you might know of any opportunities." Maddie wiped her hands on her apron, considering Grace thoughtfully. "What sort of work are you skilled at, dear?" "Sewing primarily, but I'm willing to learn whatever's needed," Grace replied. Maddie tapped her chin. "Mrs. Farnsworth at the dress shop was saying just yesterday that her eyes aren't what they used to be for fine detail work. And the hotel's always looking for help with laundry and cleaning, though that's hard work for little pay." She glanced at Samuel. "What about the boy?" "I'd need to find a place for him during working hours," Grace admitted, the logistics suddenly seeming daunting. "That's the tricky part," Maddie agreed. "Most working women here either have family to help or—" She trailed off, not needing to finish the implication that some women left their children to fend for themselves. Grace's resolve faltered. The practical challenges of establishing themselves in town were more complicated than she'd initially considered. Hank, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. "I've offered Mrs. Taylor a position at the ranch, working alongside Mrs. Coleman. Samuel would attend school with the other children in the area." Maddie's eyebrows rose. "That sounds like a fine solution to me." "I haven't decided yet," Grace clarified, feeling her cheeks warm under Maddie's knowing gaze. "Well, you think on it," Maddie said. "Meanwhile, I can introduce you to Mrs. Farnsworth if you'd like to explore that option." Before Grace could answer, the diner's door swung open and a tall, well-dressed man entered, followed by the town sheriff. Grace felt Hank tense beside her. "Mr. Owens," the well-dressed man acknowledged with a curt nod. "I was told I might find you in town today." "Mr. Blackwell," Hank replied, his tone carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" James Blackwell. Grace later learned his name was a cattle baron whose land bordered Hank's to the north. His calculating eyes swept over Grace and Samuel before returning to Hank. "I was hoping to discuss that water rights issue. The creek that runs through your property would be valuable to my northern pastures." His tone suggested this was a continuation of a previous conversation. "As I've told you before, that creek is essential to my operation," Hank said firmly. "I'm not interested in selling or leasing those rights." Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch. I'm sure your friends have other matters to attend to." The slight pause before friends carried an insinuation that made Grace bristle. "Mrs. Taylor and her son are my guests," Hank said, his voice cooling several degrees. "And I've already declined your offer multiple times, Mr. Blackwell. I don't see the point in further discussion." The sheriff, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "Now, Hank, Mr. Blackwell's offering fair money. Might be worth hearing him out." Grace noticed the familiarity with which the sheriff addressed Hank, contrasted with the formal Mr. Blackwell, and wondered at the power dynamics at play. "My answer remains no," Hank said firmly. "If you'll excuse us, we have errands to complete." He placed a protective hand at the small of Grace's back, guiding her and Samuel toward the door. The gesture was subtle but clear they were under his protection. Outside, Grace could feel the tension in Hank's posture. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Hank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Blackwell's been trying to buy up water rights all through the county. He's not used to being refused." "The sheriff seemed to be on his side," Grace observed. "Sheriff Davis owes Blackwell money from poker games," Hank explained. "Makes him less impartial than he should be." They continued their errands, with Hank introducing Grace to several townspeople, including Mrs. Farnsworth at the dress shop. The elderly seamstress was indeed looking for help, but could offer only 2 days of work per week, with no solution for what to do with Samuel during those hours. By midday, Grace was feeling discouraged. The practical challenges of establishing a new life in town seemed insurmountable without more resources than she possessed. As they ate lunch at the diner, Samuel grew increasingly tired and cranky, the excitement of the morning giving way to exhaustion. He leaned against Grace's side, his eyes drooping. "Perhaps we should head back to the ranch," Hank suggested gently. "You can consider your options there without this little one falling asleep on his feet." Grace nodded, suddenly weary herself. "That would be best, I think." As they left the diner, Grace noticed Blackwell watching them from across the street, his expression calculating. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't have explained why. The return journey was quieter than the morning's trip, with Samuel falling asleep against Hank's side after only a mile. Hank shifted his arm to support the boy more comfortably, the gesture so natural it made Grace's heart twist. "Thank you for your patience today," she said softly. "I realize now I hadn't thought through all the practicalities of finding work in town." Hank glanced at her, his expression gentle. "Life has a way of being more complicated than we expect, but sometimes the simplest solution is the right one." "You mean accepting your offer of employment?" "Yes." His eyes returned to the road. "It would give you time to save some money, make plans without immediate pressure." Grace watched the landscape roll by, considering. "May I ask why you're being so kind to us? Truly?" Hank was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "After Elizabeth died, I was lost. Angry at God, at the world, I drifted west with no purpose except to get away from memories." He adjusted the reins in his hands. "I ended up in a small town in New Mexico, dead broke and half-starved. A rancher there took me in, gave me work, taught me the cattle business." He glanced at her. "He didn't have to, I was nobody to him, but that kindness saved me, gave me purpose again." "And you're passing it forward," Grace said softly. Hank nodded. "That and—" He hesitated. "When I saw you standing on that platform, holding your boy's hand with your chin up despite everything, I admired your courage, still do." Grace felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "It doesn't feel like courage most of the time, just necessity." "That's often what courage is," Hank replied. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're afraid." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sway of the wagon soothing. "I'll accept your offer," Grace said finally. "For now, at least. Until I can make better arrangements for Samuel and myself." Hank's smile was warm and genuine. "I'm glad. Mrs. Coleman will be pleased. She's taken a liking to you both." "And you?" Grace asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Are you pleased as well?" His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Very much so, Mrs. Taylor, very much so." The following weeks established a new rhythm to Grace's life. She rose early each morning to help Beatrice prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, then attended to the house cleaning, mending, preserving food from the kitchen garden. Samuel started attending the small schoolhouse down the road, riding there each morning with Jeremiah Coleman, who dropped off the other children from the neighboring ranches. To Grace's delight, Samuel thrived in his new environment. He returned each afternoon bubbling with stories about his lessons and new friends. On weekends, Hank often found time to continue Samuel's riding lessons, much to the boy's delight. Grace found herself watching these sessions, her heart warming at the natural rapport between the man and her son. Hank never talked down to Samuel, treating his questions and observations with genuine interest. It was so different from Thomas, who had often been impatient with childish curiosity. One evening in late May, about a month after their arrival, Grace sat on the porch mending one of Hank's shirts. The sunset painted the distant hills in shades of gold and purple, and the scent of evening primrose hung in the air. Samuel had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a day of helping Jeremiah collect eggs from the chicken coop. Hank joined her on the porch, settling into the rocking chair beside hers with a contented sigh. He'd been working since before dawn, breaking new horses for a neighboring rancher. "You should let me do that," Grace said, nodding toward his hands. They were rough and chapped from work. "Do what?" "Tend to your hands. I've made a salve with beeswax and herbs from Beatrice's garden. It would help with those cracks and calluses." Hank looked at his hands as if noticing their condition for the first time. "They've been worse." Grace set aside her mending and went inside, returning with a small jar of fragrant salve. Without waiting for permission, she pulled her chair closer and took one of his hands in hers. "You're too stubborn to take proper care of yourself," she chided gently, scooping a small amount of the salve onto her fingertips. Hank remained silent as she worked the balm into his skin, her fingers moving methodically across his palm and between his fingers, easing the roughness there. His hands were large and powerful, yet they surrendered completely to her ministrations. "You have healing hands," he said finally, his voice low. Grace looked up, suddenly aware of their proximity. In the fading light, his eyes were dark and intent on her face. Something shifted in the air between them, the same unnamed current she'd felt several times in recent weeks. "I've noticed how gentle you are with the horses," she said, continuing her work. "For such strong hands." "Strength without control is just brutality," Hank replied. "My father taught me that. He was a blacksmith, had hands that could bend iron, but he could hold a baby bird without harming it. He sounds like a good man." "He was." Hank's voice held old grief. "Died when I was 16, Spanish influenza. I'm sorry." Grace squeezed his hand in sympathy. "It was a long time ago." He watched her fingers move across his skin. "What about your parents? Both gone now. My father when I was 12, my mother just before I married Thomas." Grace focused on massaging the salve into a particularly rough spot near his thumb. "She warned me against him, actually, said he had restless eyes." Restless eyes, the kind that are always looking for something better, something more, never satisfied with what's in front of them. She shook her head ruefully. "I should have listened." "We all make choices we later regret," Hank said. "The important thing is what we learn from them." Grace finished with his right hand and reached for his left, aware of the intimacy of the moment but unable to stop herself. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. "And what have you learned, Mr. Owens?" she asked softly. "That life rarely goes as planned." His fingers curled slightly around hers. "That loss can either destroy you or reshape you, and that's sometimes what you need finds you when you least expect it." Their eyes met, and Grace felt a flutter in her chest. She was suddenly, acutely aware that she was a woman still legally bound to a man who had abandoned her, sitting in the twilight with another man whose quiet strength had become increasingly important to her. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch. Hank reluctantly withdrew his hand and stood, moving to the edge of the porch. "That'll be Charlie back from town with the mail," he said. Charlie, one of the younger ranch hands, rode into the yard and dismounted with a wave to Hank. "Evening, boss, got letters and the newspaper." He handed over a small bundle. "And Mrs. Taylor, there's something for you too." Grace accepted the envelope with surprise. No one knew she was at the Double Circle Ranch except the few people she'd met in Val Verde. "Thank you, Charlie," Hank said. "Get some supper. Beatrice kept a plate warm for you." As Charlie headed to the bunkhouse, Grace examined the envelope. Her name was scrawled in a familiar hand that made her blood run cold. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank's expression darkened. "Your husband," Grace nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief. "Grace, I've been informed you're living at the Owens Ranch outside Val Verde. I'm returning to collect you and Samuel within the week. I've had a change of fortune and can now provide for my family properly. Be ready to depart." Thomas Grace read it twice, unable to believe the casual presumption in the words. After abandoning them without a penny, he now expected her to simply wait obediently for his return. "Grace." Hank's concerned voice broke through her thoughts. "What does he say?" She handed him the letter, watching his expression harden as he read it. "The audacity," Hank muttered, returning the letter to her. "He abandons you and Samuel without means of support, then expects to waltz back and reclaim you like misplaced property." "He's still legally my husband," Grace said, though the words tasted bitter. "And Samuel's father. A title he forfeited when he left you both at that depot." Hank paced the porch, his movements tense with anger. "What do you want to do?" The question startled Grace. Throughout her marriage to Thomas, her wishes had rarely been considered. Decisions were made for her, not with her. "I don't know," she admitted. "Legally, I have few rights if he wants to take Samuel." Her voice broke at the thought. Hank moved closer, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Grace, listen to me. You don't have to go with him. You've built a life here. Samuel is happy, thriving. You're respected and valued." "But the law isn't always just," Hank interrupted. "And there are ways to fight if you want to." Grace looked up at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. "Why would you help me stand against my own husband?" Hank's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "Because in these weeks I've come to." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've come to care for you and Samuel. More than I should, perhaps." The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implication. Grace felt her heart quicken, recognizing that they stood at a crossroads. "I can't ask you to fight my battles," she said finally. "You didn't ask. I'm offering." His voice was steady, certain. "But the choice must be yours. Do you want to return to Thomas?" Grace didn't hesitate. "No, I don't love him anymore. I'm not sure I ever truly did." The admission was both painful and freeing. "But he's Samuel's father. I can't deny my son his right to know his father. Even if that father abandoned him without a backward glance." Hank's tone was gentle despite his harsh words. Grace had no answer. They stood in silence as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging overhead. Finally, Hank spoke again. "Let's not decide anything tonight. Sleep on it. We'll face this together tomorrow." The word "together" lingered in Grace's mind as she prepared for bed that night. It had been so long since she'd felt she wasn't facing life's challenges alone. The thought of Hank standing beside her, supporting her decisions whatever they might be, gave her a strange new courage. Samuel stirred as she checked on him before retiring. "Mama!" "Esachich, go back to sleep, sweetheart," she whispered, smoothing his hair. "I had a dream about Papa," he murmured drowsily. "He was here, but he was angry." Grace's heart clenched. "It was just a dream. Go back to sleep now." When Samuel's breathing evened out again, Grace returned to her own room, her mind too full for sleep. She sat by the window, watching the moonlight silver the ranch yard, and contemplated her options. Thomas had legal rights as her husband and Samuel's father. Fighting him would be difficult, perhaps impossible. And yet, the thought of returning to his control, of leaving the peace and purpose she'd found at Double Circle, was unbearable. More than that, there was Hank. In the short time she'd known him, he'd shown her what a real partner could be: someone who respected her thoughts and wishes, who saw her strength rather than seeking to control it. The way he looked at her made her feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. Grace touched the wedding ring she still wore out of habit, though she had long since ceased to feel married in her heart. What would it mean to remove it? To declare herself free of a bond that had brought her more pain than joy? With sudden resolve, she twisted the gold band from her finger and placed it on the windowsill. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a contrast to Grace's troubled thoughts. She rose early and found Hank already in the kitchen, talking quietly with Jeremiah. Both men fell silent when she entered, their expressions grave. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert to the tension. Hank exchanged a glance with Jeremiah, who nodded and excused himself. "Thomas Taylor is in Val Verde," Hank said without preamble. "Arrived on yesterday's evening train, according to Charlie. He's been asking questions about you and Samuel." Grace steadied herself against the table, the news hitting her like a physical blow despite the warning of the letter. "So soon? I thought we'd have more time." "I'm afraid not." Hank's voice softened. "Have you decided what you want to do?" Before she could answer, Samuel burst into the kitchen, his face alight with the morning's possibilities. "Mr. Hank, you promised to show me how to brush down Daisy properly today. Remember?" The contrast between Samuel's innocent excitement and the adult complexities swirling around him made Grace's heart ache. How could she explain to him that his father, absent for months, had suddenly reappeared to reclaim them? "I remember, partner," Hank said, ruffling Samuel's hair. "But first, breakfast. Growing cowboys need their strength." As Samuel chattered about his plans for the day, Grace and Hank shared a look of silent understanding. They would protect this child's happiness as long as possible. After breakfast, Hank took Samuel to the stables as promised, giving Grace time to collect her thoughts. She was sitting on the porch, watching them in the distance when Beatrice joined her. "Trouble's coming," the older woman said, settling into the chair beside Grace. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Grace admitted. "My husband has returned." Beatrice nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much, with all the whispering between the men this morning." "I don't know what to do," Grace confessed. "Legally, he has every right to reclaim us." "Laws are made by men for men," Beatrice said with the wisdom of her years. "They don't always serve what's right." She studied Grace's face. "Do you want to go back to him?" "No." The certainty in her voice surprised even Grace. "He abandoned us when we needed him most, but more than that, I've changed. I'm not the same woman who followed him blindly." Beatrice smiled. "I've noticed. You stand taller now, speak your mind more freely. It suits you." Grace looked toward the stables where Hank was now lifting Samuel onto Daisy's back. "Mr. Owens has been kind to us." "Kind, yes, and more besides, I'd wager." Beatrice's knowing look made Grace blush. "The way that man watches you when you're not looking would melt butter." "Beatrice," Grace protested, though she couldn't help a small smile. "I'm just saying, life's too short for half measures. If you found something worth fighting for, then fight." She patted Grace's hand and stood. "Now, I've got bread to bake, but remember you're stronger than you know." Grace pondered Beatrice's words as the morning progressed. By midday, she had made her decision. She would not return to Thomas willingly. Whatever came next, she would face it with the newfound strength she'd discovered at Double Circle. She was helping Beatrice prepare lunch when the sound of an approaching carriage drew everyone's attention. Hank, who had been chopping wood near the house, set down his axe and moved toward the front of the property. From the kitchen window, Grace saw a smart buggy coming up the drive, driven by a man she recognized immediately despite the months of separation: Thomas. Beside him sat another man, Mr. Blackwell. The sight of them together confirmed Grace's worst suspicions about how Thomas had found her. "Stay inside with Samuel," Hank said, appearing at the kitchen door. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. Let me speak with them first. Grace nodded, her throat too tight for words. She gathered Samuel, who had been helping Beatrice set the table, into her arms. "Mama, who's coming?" he asked, sensing her tension. "Just some visitors, sweetheart. Why don't you help Mrs. Coleman in the pantry for a bit?" She exchanged a look with Beatrice, who immediately understood and led Samuel away with the promise of honey cookies. Grace moved to the front window, parting the curtain just enough to see Hank standing on the porch, his posture straight and unyielding as the buggy pulled to a stop. Thomas stepped down first, followed by Blackwell. Even from a distance, she could see that Thomas looked prosperous. His suit was new, his boots polished, his hat expensive. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she could read the body language. Thomas was gesturing emphatically, his stance aggressive. Hank remained still, his responses appearing measured but firm. Blackwell stood slightly apart, watching the confrontation with apparent interest. After several minutes, Hank pointed back toward the road, his meaning clear. "Leave." Thomas's face flushed with anger, visible even from where Grace stood. He took a step toward Hank, and Grace held her breath, fearing violence. Instead, Thomas turned and stalked back to the buggy, shouting something over his shoulder that made Hank's hands clench into fists. Blackwell lingered a moment longer, saying something to Hank before joining Thomas. The buggy departed in a cloud of dust. Grace waited by the window, her heart pounding. When Hank entered the house, his face was grim. "What happened?" she asked, searching his expression for clues. "Your husband demanded I produce you and Samuel immediately. I informed him that you're not property to be produced and that any discussion would happen on your terms, not his." Hank's jaw tightened. He didn't take it well. And Blackwell, why was he there? Apparently, he's offered Thomas a job managing some of his northern properties. In exchange, Thomas has promised to help convince me to sell those water rights. Hank shook his head in disgust. Using a man's family as leverage. It's despicable. Grace felt cold despite the warm day. "What did Thomas say before he left?" Hank hesitated. "That he'd be back with the sheriff. That as your legal husband he has rights that will be enforced." Fear coursed through Grace. "He could take Samuel. Not if we act quickly." Hank took her hands in his. "Grace, listen to me. Thomas abandoned you both, left you without means of support. That's grounds for divorce in Texas, especially with witnesses who saw him leave you at the depot." Divorce? The word felt foreign on Grace's tongue. In her social circle back east, divorce had been whispered about, a shameful last resort. Yes, it would free you legally from Thomas, give you sole custody of Samuel. Hank's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I know it's not a decision to make lightly, but it may be the only way to protect your future and Samuel's, even if I wanted to." Grace struggled with the concept. Such things take time. If Thomas returns with the sheriff. Judge Parker in Val Verde is a fair man, not in Blackwell's pocket. If we ride into town now, explain the situation, he might issue a temporary order preventing Thomas from taking Samuel until a hearing can be held. Hank's eyes held hers, steady and reassuring. "But Grace, this has to be your decision. I'll support whatever you choose." Grace took a deep breath, thinking of Samuel's happiness, of the life they'd begun to build at Double Circle, of the way Hank had shown her what respect and partnership could truly mean. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "I'll file for divorce." Relief washed over Hank's features. "I'll have the wagon ready in 10 minutes. We should bring Samuel. I don't trust Thomas not to try something while we're gone." Grace nodded, moving to find her son. As she explained to Samuel that they needed to go to town for important business, she was struck by how calm she felt despite the tumult around them. The decision, once made, had brought clarity. The journey to Val Verde was tense but uneventful. Hank drove the wagon with one hand on the reins and the other resting on the rifle beside him, his eyes constantly scanning the road. Samuel, sensing the gravity of the situation despite Grace's attempts to shield him, sat quietly between them. Judge Parker, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, listened to their story in his office behind the courthouse. He asked pointed questions about Thomas's abandonment, and Grace answered truthfully, describing how her husband had left them at the depot without money or resources. "And you've been employed at Mr. Owens' ranch since then?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor. I work as Mrs. Coleman's assistant in the house and Samuel attends the local school." Judge Parker studied her face, then Hank's. Something in his expression suggested he understood more than what was being said. "I'll issue a temporary order preventing Mr. Taylor from removing the child from your custody until a formal hearing," he said finally. "But Mrs. Taylor, you should understand that divorce cases can be complicated. Your husband may make counterclaims." "What kind of counterclaims?" Grace asked, her stomach tightening. The judge's expression was delicate. "He may question your relationship with Mr. Owens, for instance, suggest impropriety." Heat flooded Grace's cheeks. "There has been no impropriety, Your Honor." "I believe you, Mrs. Taylor, but courts can be swayed by appearances." He glanced at Hank. "Mr. Owens, your reputation in this county is solid. That will help, but I advise caution in the coming weeks." "Understood, Judge," Hank said soberly. As they left the judge's chambers with the protective order in hand, Grace felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won the first skirmish, but the battle was far from over. "What did the judge mean about being careful?" she asked Hank as they walked back to the wagon. Hank sighed. "He meant that Thomas might try to paint our arrangement in an unflattering light, suggest that there's something inappropriate between us to undermine your case for custody." "But that's not true," Grace protested. "Truth doesn't always matter as much as perception," Hank said grimly. "Especially when it comes to a woman's reputation." They were discussing their next steps when a voice called out from across the street. "Well, if it isn't the happy little family." Thomas stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel, his expression cold. Beside him, Sheriff Davis watched with apparent interest. Grace instinctively pulled Samuel closer to her side. Hank stepped slightly in front of them, his posture protective but not aggressive. "Mr. Taylor," Hank acknowledged calmly, "we have business to attend to. Good day." "Business that involves my wife and son." Thomas strode across the street, ignoring the passing wagons. "I think not." He reached for Samuel, but Hank smoothly intercepted him. "I wouldn't do that, Taylor. Judge Parker has issued an order. The boy stays with his mother until a hearing." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "You've been filling my wife's head with nonsense, Owens. She belongs with her husband." "I belong where I choose," Grace said, finding her voice. "You abandoned us, Thomas, left us without money or protection. You forfeited any right to decide our future." "Is that what you told the judge?" Thomas sneered. "Did you also tell him you've been living in sin with this rancher, that you've set a fine example for our son?" "That's enough," Hank said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Taylor works honestly for her keep at my ranch with Mrs. Coleman as chaperone. There's been no impropriety." The sheriff sauntered over, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Now, folks, let's not cause a scene in the middle of the street." "Show him the order, Grace," Hank said, not taking his eyes off Thomas. Grace handed the document to the sheriff, who scanned it with a frown. "This seems in order. Mr. Taylor, you can't take the boy until the hearing." Thomas's jaw worked as he struggled to control his temper. "This isn't over, Grace, not by a long shot." His eyes shifted to Hank. "And you? You think you can steal another man's family? There will be consequences." With that, he turned and stalked back across the street, leaving the sheriff standing awkwardly before them. "You'd best be careful, Owens," the lawman said quietly. "Blackwell's backing Taylor in this, and he holds a lot of sway with some folks around here." Hank nodded. "Appreciate the warning, Sheriff, but right always wins in the end." "Hope you're right," the sheriff replied, tipping his hat before following Thomas. The confrontation left Grace shaking, though she tried to hide it for Samuel's sake. The boy had watched the exchange with wide, confused eyes. "Was that Papa?" he asked as Hank helped them into the wagon. He looked angry. Grace exchanged a glance with Hank, uncertain how to explain. To her surprise, Hank crouched to Samuel's level. "Yes, that was your father," he said honestly. "He's upset because he wants you and your mama to go with him, but your mama thinks it's better for you both to stay at the ranch for now. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things." Samuel considered this. "I don't want to go with him. I want to stay with you and Mama and Daisy." Hank smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "Well, partner, we're doing our best to make that happen." The ride back to the ranch was subdued, each adult lost in their own thoughts. Samuel eventually fell asleep against Grace's side, the excitement of the day proving too much for him. "I'm sorry about all this," Grace said softly, breaking the silence. "You've been nothing but kind to us, and now you're caught in our troubles." Hank glanced at her, his expression gentle. "There are troubles now. I told you before, you and Samuel are mine to look after." The words, repeated from their first meeting, carried new weight now. Grace studied his profile, strong and steadfast in the afternoon light. What Thomas said. She began hesitantly. "Is meaningless," Hank interrupted firmly. "We know the truth." "Yes, but others may believe him. Your reputation, my reputation, can withstand gossip. I'm more concerned about yours." He looked troubled. "Perhaps it would be better if you stayed in town until the hearing." "The hotel, no," Grace said firmly. "I won't be driven away by threats and insinuations. Samuel is happy at the ranch. We both are." Hank's hands tightened on the reins. "Grace, if there's talk, if people question your character because of me—" "Let them talk," she said with newfound resolve. "I've spent too much of my life worrying about what others think, trying to please a husband who saw me as property rather than a partner." Her voice softened. "Besides, the truth is, I care for you, Hank. More than I should, perhaps, but I won't deny it any longer." The wagon slowed as Hank turned to look at her, his expression unguarded for once. "Grace." His words were cut off by the sound of riders approaching from behind. Hank immediately returned his attention to the road, his posture tensing. "3 riders coming fast," he said, reaching for his rifle. "Get down, both of you." Grace pulled Samuel closer, shielding his sleeping form with her body. Her heart pounded as the hoofbeats grew louder. To her relief, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Owens, hold up." It was Charlie, one of the ranch hands, accompanied by 2 others from Double Circle. Hank relaxed slightly, drawing the wagon to a stop. "What is it, Charlie?" he asked as the young man brought his horse alongside. "Mrs. Coleman sent us to find you," Charlie said, his expression urgent. "There's trouble at the ranch. Blackwell's men showed up, said they were looking for strays that crossed onto our land. But they're armed and they've been asking questions about you and Mrs. Taylor." Hank's expression hardened. "How many?" "5 that we saw. Jeremiah's keeping an eye on them, but he thought you should know." Hank made a quick decision. "Charlie, I want you to take Mrs. Taylor and Samuel to the Wilsons' place. Explain the situation to Frank, he'll understand." "No," Grace protested. "I won't be separated from you. Grace, please." "If Thomas and Blackwell are working together, they might try to use you and Samuel as leverage." Hank's eyes were pleading. "The Wilsons are good people. You'll be safe there until I sort this out." Grace wanted to argue further, but the gravity in Hank's expression stopped her. Very well. But promise me you'll be careful. I promise. His hand briefly covered hers. I've got too much to live for to be reckless. The simple statement, laden with meaning, made Grace's throat tight with emotion. Charlie dismounted to take the wagon reins, while one of the other hands helped Grace and the now awake Samuel onto his horse. "Mama, where are we going?" Samuel asked drowsily. "To visit some friends for a little while," Grace explained, holding him securely as the horse began to move. "It's an adventure." She looked back over her shoulder as they rode away, watching Hank and the remaining hand gallop toward the ranch. A prayer formed in her heart that this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. The Wilson Ranch was smaller than Double Circle but well-maintained, with a cozy farmhouse and neat outbuildings. Frank Wilson, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, and his wife Martha welcomed them without question when Charlie explained the situation. "Blackwell's been causing trouble up and down the valley," Frank said grimly. "About time someone stood up to him." "But why target Mr. Owens specifically?" Grace asked as Martha settled Samuel at the kitchen table with milk and cookies. "Water rights," Frank explained. "That spring on Hank's property feeds the creek that runs through the valley. In a drought year like this one, whoever controls that water has power over everyone downstream." Charlie left to rejoin Hank, promising to return with news as soon as possible. The hours of waiting were torturous for Grace. She helped Martha prepare dinner, her hands moving mechanically while her mind conjured increasingly frightening scenarios. Samuel, thankfully, adapted quickly to their temporary refuge, fascinated by the Wilsons' collection of carved wooden animals. By nightfall, he was sleeping peacefully in a small bedroom off the kitchen, unaware of the adult tensions surrounding him. "He'll be all right, you know," Martha said, joining Grace by the window where she stood watching the road. "Hank Owens is no fool. He won't risk a direct confrontation if he can avoid it." "It's not just Blackwell," Grace admitted. "My husband has returned claiming his rights to Samuel and me." Martha's expression was sympathetic but unsurprised. "Men like that always turn up when you least want them to, like bad pennies." She patted Grace's hand. "But from what I've seen, Hank Owens cares for you and your boy. He won't let you go without a fight." "That's what worries me," Grace whispered. "I don't want anyone fighting for us, getting hurt because of us." "Sometimes a man needs something worth fighting for," Martha replied wisely. "Gives him purpose. And you, my dear, have brought light back to Hank's eyes. Anyone with sense can see it." Before Grace could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approached the house. Frank grabbed his shotgun from above the door, but lowered it when Hank's voice called out a greeting. Grace rushed to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of him dismounting in the yard. His clothes were dusty and there was a small cut above his left eye, but he was otherwise unharmed. "Hank!" she cried, forgetting propriety in her joy at seeing him safe. "What happened?" He climbed the porch steps, his tired face breaking into a smile at her obvious concern. "Blackwell's men were just trying to intimidate us. There was a brief scuffle when they wouldn't leave, but no serious harm done. Jeremiah has the hands keeping watch at the ranch tonight just to be safe." "And Thomas?" Grace asked, dreading the answer. No sign of him. Hank accepted the coffee Martha offered with grateful thanks. "But Blackwell made it clear they're working together. Your husband has convinced him that he can persuade you to support selling those water rights once he has you and Samuel back under his control." Grace felt cold despite the warm evening. "He's using Samuel as leverage." "Trying to," Hank corrected. "But we have the judge's order and the hearing is set for next week. Until then, Thomas can't legally take Samuel from you." "Legally being the operative word," Frank muttered. "Men like Blackwell and your husband don't always concern themselves with legalities. Which is why I think you and Samuel should stay here until the hearing, Hank said to Grace. The Wilsons' place is less obvious than Double Circle. I couldn't impose, Grace began. Nonsense, Martha interrupted. We'd be delighted to have you. It gets lonely out here sometimes, just the two of us. Grace looked from Martha's kind face to Hank's concerned one, knowing they were right but hating the thought of being separated from him. What about you? She asked Hank. Won't you be in danger if you return to the ranch? I'll be fine. I have good men around me, he smiled reassuringly. Besides, I need to make sure everything's in order for the hearing. Your future and Samuel's may depend on it. Later, after the Wilsons had retired and Samuel slept peacefully, Grace and Hank stood on the porch, speaking in low voices beneath the vast canopy of stars. I don't like being away from you, Grace admitted. Especially now. Hank's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. I don't like it either, but keeping you and Samuel safe is what matters most. When did we become so important to you? She asked softly. Why risk so much for us? Hank was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep with emotion. After Elizabeth died, I thought that part of my life was over. The part where you share yourself with someone, build dreams together. He turned to face her, his features silver in the moonlight. Then you appeared on that platform, holding your son's hand, standing tall despite everything. And something inside me recognized you, not just as someone who needed help, but as someone who could help me too. Help you. Grace whispered, find my way back to living, not just existing. His free hand came up to gently touch her cheek. You reminded me that there are things worth caring about, worth fighting for. You and Samuel. You brought color back to a world that had been gray for too long. Grace leaned into his touch, her heart full. I felt it too, that recognition. As if a part of me had been waiting to find you, even when I didn't know I was looking. The confession hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Hank's eyes, dark and intent in the moonlight, held hers. I want to kiss you, he said simply. But you're still another man's wife, and I respect you too much to complicate your situation further. Grace's breath caught. The honorable restraint in his words only increased her admiration for him and her longing. What if I want you to kiss me anyway? She asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Hank smiled, a slow curve of his lips that made her heart race. Then I'd say we both have something to look forward to once you're free to make that choice. He lifted her hand to his lips instead, pressing a kiss to her palm that somehow felt more intimate than anything she'd experienced before. I should go, he said reluctantly. I'll return tomorrow to check on you both. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt a curious mixture of frustration and anticipation. For the first time in years, she was certain about what she wanted and determined to claim it, once the legal barriers were removed. The days at the Wilson ranch passed slowly. Samuel, adaptable as children often are, quickly settled into a routine, helping Frank with simple chores in the morning and playing with the carved animals in the afternoon. Grace assisted Martha with household tasks, grateful for the older woman's practical wisdom and no-nonsense approach to life's challenges. Hank visited daily, bringing news from town and the ranch. The hearing was set for Monday, 4 days away. Judge Parker had agreed to consider Grace's petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment, with the station master and Maddie from the diner willing to testify that Thomas had indeed left Grace and Samuel alone without means of support. What about Thomas? Grace asked during one of Hank's visits. Has he filed any counterclaims? Hank's expression was grim. He's claiming that you abandoned the marital home, not the other way around. Says he left you with money for a hotel room while he sought work and returned to find you gone. "That's a lie," Grace exclaimed, indignant. "He left us without a penny, I know," Hank said soothingly. "And we have witnesses who saw your condition that day. The judge is fair, he'll hear both sides." The night before the hearing, Grace could not sleep. She paced the small bedroom, careful not to wake Samuel, her mind racing with worries. What if the judge believed Thomas's version of events? What if she lost custody of Samuel? What if her newfound feelings for Hank were used against her? A soft knock at the door startled her. Martha stood there in her dressing gown, holding a steaming cup. "Chamomile tea," she said, offering it to Grace. "Thought you might need it. I could hear you pacing from down the hall." Grace accepted the cup gratefully. "I'm sorry to disturb you." "Nonsense. It's natural to be anxious." Martha settled onto the edge of the bed. "Want to talk about it?" "I'm afraid," Grace admitted, sipping the soothing tea. "Afraid the judge will give Samuel to Thomas. Afraid I'll never be free to." She trailed off, embarrassed. "To follow your heart," Martha finished with a knowing smile. "It's plain as day how you feel about Hank Owens." "And how he feels about you." Grace blushed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes," Martha chuckled. "But that's not a bad thing. True feeling is rare enough in this world, it should be celebrated, not hidden." "But what if the judge uses it against me? Says I'm an unfit mother for having such feelings while still legally married?" Martha's expression turned serious. "Listen to me, Grace. You didn't leave your husband, he left you. You didn't seek out another man's protection, circumstances forced you to accept help. And if, in the midst of that, you discovered what real respect and caring look like, well, that's not something any judge should condemn." Her practical perspective eased some of Grace's anxiety. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." "Get some sleep if you can," Martha advised, rising. "Tomorrow will come soon enough, and you'll need your strength." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot, a typical June day in South Texas. Grace dressed carefully in her best dress, the blue one Beatrice had given her, freshly pressed by Martha. She arranged her hair simply but neatly and helped Samuel into his cleanest clothes. "We're going to see a judge today," she explained to him as she combed his hair. "He's going to talk to me and your father about some important things." Samuel looked up at her with solemn eyes. "Is the judge going to make us go away with Papa?" Grace's heart clenched at his directness. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope not. But whatever happens, I promise we'll be together." "I want to stay with Mr. Hank," Samuel said, his lower lip trembling slightly. "He teaches me things and doesn't yell like Papa did." Grace pulled him into a tight hug, fighting back tears at his simple assessment. "I want that too. We'll just have to see what the judge decides." Hank arrived with the wagon shortly after breakfast. He looked handsome and dignified in a clean white shirt and dark waistcoat, his hair neatly trimmed. His smile when he saw Grace was warm enough to steady her nerves. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you. You look quite distinguished yourself." Their eyes held for a moment, unspoken feelings passing between them, until Samuel broke the moment by launching himself at Hank's legs. "Mr. Hank, I'm wearing my special shirt for the judge." Hank crouched down, inspecting Samuel seriously. "Very impressive, partner. The judge will certainly notice what a fine young man you are." The drive to town was quiet, each adult lost in thoughts of what the day might bring. Samuel, picking up on their tension, sat unusually still between them, occasionally reaching for Grace's hand or Hank's sleeve as if to reassure himself of their presence. Val Verde was busier than usual, the monthly court day bringing people from outlying farms and ranches. As they approached the courthouse, Grace spotted Thomas standing on the steps with Blackwell and Sheriff Davis. Her stomach tightened at the sight of her husband, smartly dressed and looking confident. "Remember," Hank said quietly as he helped her down from the wagon, "just tell the truth." That's all any of us can do. Inside the courthouse, Judge Parker sat at a large desk on a raised platform. The room was already half full, news of the case having spread through the small community. Grace felt eyes on her as Hank escorted her and Samuel to a bench near the front. Thomas sat on the opposite side of the aisle, his expression smug. He nodded to Grace with mock courtesy, ignoring Hank completely. The proceedings began formally, with Judge Parker explaining that he would hear evidence regarding both the custody arrangement for Samuel Taylor and Grace's petition for divorce. "This is highly unusual," he noted, looking over his spectacles at the parties involved. "Divorce is not something this court grants lightly, particularly when a child is involved." Thomas was called first. He presented himself as a devoted husband and father who had briefly left his family in Val Verde while seeking better opportunities further west. According to his testimony, he had provided Grace with money for lodging and expected to return within days, only to find she had taken up with another man. "I was devastated, Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "To think my wife would abandon her vows so quickly, exposing our son to such irregular arrangements." Grace clenched her hands in her lap, fighting the urge to stand and contradict him immediately. Hank's steady presence beside her helped her maintain her composure. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she approached the judge's desk with her head held high. She recounted the events truthfully, how Thomas had gambled away their savings, promised a fresh start in California, then abandoned them at the depot without resources. "Mr. Owens offered us shelter and honest work when we had nowhere else to turn," she concluded. "He has shown Samuel and me nothing but respect and kindness. Any suggestion of impropriety is false and malicious." The station master corroborated her account, testifying that he had seen Thomas leave Grace and Samuel alone at the depot, and that Grace had appeared distressed and without means. Maddie from the diner also testified, describing Grace's condition when she first arrived in town with Hank. "That woman hadn't eaten properly in days," Maddie declared firmly. "And the child was hungry too. If that's a husband providing for his family, then I'm the Queen of England." The courtroom tittered at her blunt assessment, and even Judge Parker's mouth twitched beneath his mustache. The testimony continued throughout the morning, with Beatrice Coleman speaking to Grace's character and the propriety of the arrangements at Double Circle Ranch. Frank and Martha Wilson described the events of the past week, including Thomas's association with Blackwell and the apparent intimidation tactics. Finally, Judge Parker called Samuel forward. Grace held her breath as her son approached the judge's desk, looking tiny against the imposing furniture. "Now, young man," the judge said kindly, "I just have a few questions for you. You don't need to be scared." Samuel nodded solemnly. "I'm not scared. Mr. Hank says brave men tell the truth even when it's hard." Something softened in Judge Parker's expression. "Mr. Hank is right about that." "Can you tell me about living at the ranch?" Samuel brightened. "I have my own bed and I go to school now. I'm learning to read and Mr. Hank teaches me about horses on the weekends. Mrs. Coleman makes the best cookies and Mama smiles a lot more now." "She smiles more," the judge prompted. Samuel nodded. "She used to cry at night when she thought I was sleeping when we lived with Papa, but she doesn't cry anymore." He glanced at Thomas, then back at the judge, lowering his voice to a stage whisper. "Papa got angry a lot. He broke Mama's special music box once." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at this revelation. She hadn't realized Samuel had witnessed that incident or that he'd heard her crying at night during the difficult last months with Thomas. "And how do you feel about possibly going to live with your father again?" Judge Parker asked, gently. Samuel's answer was immediate and clear. "I want to stay with Mama and Mr. Hank. Papa left us alone at the train place. Mr. Hank would never do that." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to affect everyone in the courtroom. Judge Parker thanked Samuel and sent him back to Grace, then called for a recess to consider his decision. The hour-long wait felt interminable. Grace, Hank, and Samuel sat in the shade of an oak tree outside the courthouse, sharing a simple lunch that Martha had packed for them. Thomas remained inside with Blackwell and the sheriff, occasionally visible through the windows in what appeared to be intense conversation. "Whatever happens," Hank said quietly as Samuel explored the tree's lower branches, "know that you handled yourself with dignity in there. I'm proud of you." Grace managed a smile despite her nerves. "Thank you for standing by us. Regardless of the judge's decision, I won't forget what you've done." "I'm not going anywhere, Grace," Hank said, his voice low and certain. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." When the court reconvened, the room was even more crowded than before, word having spread about the dramatic testimony. Judge Parker entered looking grave, and the room fell silent as he took his seat. "I've considered the evidence presented today with great care," he began. "Matters involving the dissolution of marriage and the custody of children are among the most serious this court addresses." He looked first at Thomas. "Mr. Taylor, your account of events is contradicted by multiple witnesses who have no apparent reason to falsify their testimony. More troublingly, your association with Mr. Blackwell and the reported intimidation tactics suggest a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the character of a devoted family man." Thomas started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Mrs. Taylor," he continued, turning to Grace, "your petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment is supported by credible testimony. Furthermore, your conduct since being left at the depot appears to have been above reproach, focused on providing stability for your son in difficult circumstances." Grace held her breath, hardly daring to hope. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that the marriage between Thomas and Grace Taylor is dissolved, effective immediately." Judge Parker's voice rang clear in the hushed courtroom. "Full custody of the minor child, Samuel Taylor, is awarded to his mother, Grace Taylor, with reasonable visitation rights for the father to be arranged through this court." A collective murmur ran through the room. Grace felt light-headed with relief, Hank's steady hand at her elbow keeping her grounded. "Furthermore," the judge continued, silencing the room again, "given the testimony regarding potential threats, I am issuing a protective order requiring Thomas Taylor to maintain a respectful distance from Mrs. Taylor and her son, except during court-approved visitations." He fixed Thomas with a stern look. "Mr. Taylor, be advised that violation of this order will result in your arrest. Do you understand?" Thomas, his face mottled with anger, gave a curt nod. "Yes, Your Honor, but this isn't justice. That woman and that man have made a fool of me, living together in sin while my son—" "That's enough," Judge Parker interrupted sharply. "My ruling stands. This court is adjourned." He brought down his gavel with finality, and the tension that had held Grace rigid for hours suddenly dissolved. She was free. Samuel was safe. Hank's arm came around her shoulders in a supportive embrace as people began to file out of the courtroom. "You did it," he whispered. "You were magnificent." Samuel, who had been sitting quietly beside Beatrice during the proceedings, ran to Grace and threw his arms around her waist. "Are we going home now, Mama? To the ranch?" "Yes, sweetheart," Grace said, kneeling to embrace him properly. "We're going home." As they left the courthouse, Thomas intercepted them on the steps. His handsome face was twisted with malice. "This isn't over, Grace," he hissed. "You've humiliated me in front of the entire county. There will be consequences." Hank stepped forward, his expression dangerously calm. The judge was clear, Taylor. Stay away from Grace and Samuel unless you want to find yourself in jail. Thomas glared at him. You think you've won. You're a fool, Owens. Blackwell doesn't forget those who cross him. Neither do I, Hank replied evenly. Remember that. Thomas gave Grace one last venomous look before stalking away to where Blackwell waited by a carriage. I should be afraid of him, Grace said as they watched him depart. But strangely, I'm not anymore. Hank smiled down at her. That's because you found your strength. It was always there, you just needed the right circumstances to discover it. The ride back to Double Circle was jubilant, a stark contrast to the tense journey into town. Samuel chattered excitedly, already planning to tell Daisy the horse about their adventure. Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of her unhappy marriage finally lifted from her shoulders. At the ranch, Beatrice and Jeremiah had prepared a celebratory dinner, confident in the positive outcome of the hearing. The entire household, including the ranch hands, gathered to share the meal and toast Grace and Samuel's new beginning. Later, after Samuel had been tucked into bed, exhausted by the day's excitement, Grace found Hank on the porch. He stood leaning against a post, looking out at the starlit landscape of his ranch. Thank you, she said, joining him, for everything. I wouldn't have had the courage to seek a divorce without your support. Hank turned to her, his expression open and unguarded in the moonlight. You're stronger than you know, Grace. I just reminded you of that strength. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them, distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. So, Hank said finally, a hint of humor in his voice, it seems you're no longer another man's wife. Grace felt her heart quicken. It seems that way. And I believe there was something we both were looking forward to once that was the case. His voice had dropped to a lower register that sent a pleasant shiver through her. I seem to recall something of the sort, Grace replied, stepping closer to him. Hank's hand came up to gently trace the curve of her cheek. I've wanted to do this since the first week you were here, he murmured. Only the first week, Grace teased, tilting her face up to his. I must be losing my appeal, Hank laughed softly. Never. Then his lips found hers, gentle at first, as if giving her time to change her mind, but Grace had no intention of backing away. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Grace Taylor. Have almost from the beginning, though I tried not to. The declaration, simple and heartfelt, brought tears to Grace's eyes. And I love you, Hank Owens. You showed me what it means to be truly seen and respected. He kissed her again, more urgently this time, his arms pulling her close against him. Grace melted into the embrace, reveling in the rightness of it, the sense of coming home she felt in his arms. They were interrupted by a small voice from the doorway. Mama, Mr. Hank. They turned to find Samuel standing there in his nightshirt, rubbing his eyes sleepily. What is it, sweetheart? Grace asked, moving toward him. Did you have a bad dream? Samuel shook his head. I woke up and you weren't there. I got scared. Hank crouched down to Samuel's level. There's nothing to be scared of, partner. Your mama was just getting some fresh air with me. Were you kissing her? Samuel asked with a child's directness. Grace felt her cheeks warm, but Hank answered without embarrassment. Yes, I was. Because I care very much for your mama and for you too. Is that all right with you? Samuel considered this seriously, then nodded. Does that mean you're going to be my new papa? The innocent question hung in the air. Grace looked at Hank, unsure how to respond, but he seemed unruffled. Well, that's something your mama and I would need to discuss, he said carefully. But I'd certainly like to be a part of your lives permanently if you both want that. Samuel nodded solemnly. I do. You don't yell and you teach me about horses. High praise indeed, Hank said with a smile, ruffling the boy's hair. Now, how about I carry you back to bed, and maybe read you a story to help you fall asleep again? Yes, please. Samuel held up his arms to be lifted. As Grace watched Hank carry her son back inside, his strong arms cradling Samuel with such gentle care, she felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what a family should be built on: respect, kindness, and genuine love. She followed them inside, listening from the doorway as Hank read from one of his treasured books, his deep voice weaving the tale of a brave knight and his adventures. Samuel's eyes grew heavy again, and by the story's end, he was fast asleep. Hank carefully tucked the blanket around him and rejoined Grace in the hallway. He's a remarkable boy, he said softly. You've done an amazing job with him, especially under difficult circumstances. He likes you very much, Grace replied. Children have good instincts about people. And what about their mothers? Hank asked, his voice teasing but his eyes serious. What do their instincts tell them? Grace smiled up at him. That sometimes life takes unexpected turns, leading you exactly where you need to be, even when it's not where you plan to go. Quoting me now, Hank chuckled, drawing her close again. It was a good line, Grace admitted. And true. He kissed her again, softly this time, mindful of the sleeping child nearby. We should probably be more discreet, he murmured against her lips, at least until enough time has passed to make things proper. Grace sighed, acknowledging the wisdom in his words despite her reluctance to end their closeness. You're right. The judge might have granted the divorce, but society will expect a decent interval before I can properly court you, Hank finished with a smile. I'm willing to wait as long as necessary, Grace. You're worth waiting for. The next weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm of work and gradual courtship. Hank was careful to maintain propriety in public, aware that gossip could still harm Grace's reputation despite the judge's ruling. But in private moments, watching the sunset from the porch after Samuel was asleep, riding together to check the distant pastures, quiet conversations by the fire, their bond deepened and strengthened. Thomas made one attempt to visit Samuel, arriving at the ranch unannounced one Sunday afternoon. The meeting was tense but brief, with Samuel remaining distant and Thomas clearly uncomfortable in Hank's territory. He didn't request another visitation after that. Blackwell proved more persistent in his harassment, using his influence to create small difficulties for double-circle delayed deliveries from the general store, problems with cattle buyers, rumors spread in town. But Hank's reputation for fairness and honest dealing was too well established to be easily undermined. By late summer, the ranch was prospering despite these challenges. The spring rains had been good to the valley, the cattle were fat, and the hay harvest abundant. Samuel had blossomed, growing taller and more confident under Hank's patient guidance and Grace's loving care. On a golden evening in September, exactly 4 months after Grace and Samuel had first arrived at the depot, Hank suggested a ride to the high meadow overlooking the ranch. Just the two of us, he said. Beatrice will watch Samuel. They rode out as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in amber and gold. The high meadow was carpeted with late wildflowers, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed grass. Hank spread a blanket beneath a lone oak tree, producing a simple picnic from his saddlebags: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a bottle of wine. This is lovely, Grace said, accepting the glass of wine he offered. What's the occasion? Do I need one to spend time alone with the woman I love? Hank asked, his smile teasing but his eyes serious. They ate and talked as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the valley. Grace could see the whole of Double Circle spread out below them, the main house with its welcoming porch, the barn and corrals, the bunkhouse for the hands, the small garden Beatrice tended with such care. It had become home in a way no place had ever been before. As they finished the wine, Hank grew unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, touching his hand lightly. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I'm thinking about the day I found you at the depot. How fate or chance or whatever you want to call it brought you into my life when I didn't even know I was looking for you." Grace squeezed his hands, feeling her heart quicken. "I remember thinking you were too good to be true, this tall cowboy offering help with no apparent ulterior motive." "Oh, I had motives," Hank admitted with a slow smile. "I just didn't recognize them at the time. But from the moment I said you're both mine now, something in me knew it was true in a way I hadn't intended." "I was quite indignant about that, as I recall," Grace laughed. "Rightfully so." Hank's expression turned serious again. "But now I'm hoping you might consider making it true in every way." He released her hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Grace's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but beautiful design of gold set with a small, perfect diamond. "Grace Taylor," Hank said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your courage. I love the way you've brought warmth and purpose back into my life. I love Samuel as if he were my own son." He took a deep breath. "Would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it still brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Then more strongly, "Yes, Hank, I would be proud to be your wife." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise. When they finally parted, Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Samuel will be delighted," she murmured. "He's been asking when you're going to be his papa for weeks now." Hank chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear. "Smart boy. I was thinking we could build an addition to the house, give him a bigger room as he grows, maybe add a proper library." "You're already planning expansions," Grace teased. "Well, we might need the space," Hank said casually. "Especially if we decide to give Samuel some brothers or sisters someday." The thought of children with Hank, of expanding their family, building a future together, filled Grace with a warm glow of anticipation. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." They were married on a crisp October day, with the cottonwoods turning gold along the creek. The ceremony was held at Double Circle, with Judge Parker himself officiating. Samuel stood proudly beside Hank, wearing a miniature version of Hank's suit and beaming with importance as he handed over the rings when asked. The entire community turned out to celebrate ranch hands and their families, neighbors from miles around, townspeople from Val Verde. Even Sheriff Davis attended, having gradually distanced himself from Blackwell as the cattle baron's influence in the county waned. Maddie from the diner baked a magnificent cake, and Beatrice outdid herself preparing a feast that would be talked about for years to come. Jeremiah Coleman, normally a man of few words, gave a touching toast to the bride and groom, bringing tears to many eyes with his sincere wishes for their happiness. As the celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing under lantern light in the yard, Hank drew Grace away for a quiet moment on the porch. "Happy, Mrs. Owens?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Completely," she replied, savoring the new name. "Though I'm still getting used to it. We have a lifetime for that." He kissed her gently, then more deeply as she responded with enthusiasm. They were interrupted by the patter of small feet on the porch boards. Samuel, his face smudged with cake, bounded up to them. "Mama, Papa, come dance," he demanded, tugging at their hands. "Mr. Jeremiah is playing the fiddle." Hank swung the boy up into his arms. "Papa, is it? I like the sound of that." Samuel nodded seriously. "That's what you are now, for real and forever." "For real and forever," Hank agreed, looking at Grace with such love that her heart felt full to bursting. "All three of us." As they rejoined the celebration, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From the moment of despair on that depot platform to this perfect happiness, a family forged not by birth but by choice, by love, by the quiet certainty that they belonged together. She watched as Hank led Samuel in an impromptu dance, the man's strong hands guiding the boy's small ones with the same patience he showed when teaching him to ride. This was what she had always wanted without knowing how to name it, not just security or companionship, but partnership. A love built on mutual respect and genuine caring. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Samuel slept soundly in his room, Grace stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the starlit expanse of Double Circle, their land, their home, their future. Hank's arms came around her from behind, drawing her back against his chest. "What are you thinking, wife?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That life has a way of putting us where we need to be," she replied, echoing his words from months before. "Even when it's not where we plan to go." "Wise words," he chuckled. "I should remember them." Grace turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "I never planned to be left at a depot in a strange town with my son and no prospects, but if that hadn't happened, then I wouldn't have found you," Hank finished. "And I wouldn't have been able to say, 'You're both mine now,' and mean it," Grace added softly. "With all my heart," Hank promised, lowering his lips to hers. "For real and forever." In the years that followed, Double Circle prospered and grew. Hank's careful management of the water resources benefited not just their ranch but the entire valley, eventually earning even Blackwell's grudging respect. Samuel grew into a fine young man with his mother's compassion and his adoptive father's steady integrity. He was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, named for the woman Hank had once loved, and later by twin brothers who brought chaotic energy to the once quiet household. Thomas Taylor eventually moved further west, rarely exercising his visitation rights. When Samuel turned 16, he received a letter from his birth father, attempting to reconnect. With Hank and Grace's support, Samuel met with Thomas, the encounter helping him understand his past and appreciate even more deeply the family that had chosen him. Grace often thought back to that desperate day at the depot, when all seemed lost. How could she have known then that being abandoned would lead her to her true home? That a stranger's kindness would blossom into the deepest love she had ever known? Life indeed had its own wisdom, placing her exactly where she needed to be in the arms of a man who saw her strength even when she couldn't, who loved her son as his own, who built with her a family bound not by obligation, but by choice, by love renewed each day in 1,000 small gestures of care. And whenever new challenges arose, as they inevitably did, Grace and Hank faced them together, remembering always the promise made on that depot platform and renewed through the years. "You're both mine now, for real and forever."